It's episode 131 of the Author Stories podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. Find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com, and when you go over there, look over in the right-hand sidebar. There's some links where you can subscribe to the show over on iTunes, on Google Play, Stitcher Radio. There's even a YouTube playlist over there where you can, if you prefer to listen to shows on YouTube, you can do it there. And if you do, subscribe to the channel over at YouTube. All of these different delivery venues help other people find the show, and I try to make it as easy and as accessible for everyone to find the show as possible. I have a new story out. It's called The Hereafter. It was originally published in Tales from the Canyons of the Damned, Volume 4, and it's available for 99 cents right now. It's a great spooky story for Halloween. I hope you'll go pick it up. I also have Seventh Son of a Seventh Son and Mulligan on sale for 99 cents each, and The Witching Hour is free right now, as well as The Visitation. So go check out Amazon.com/author/Hank Garner and pick up some great spooky reading. Before we get into this week's great interview, I've got a commercial spot for you for Richard Gleaves' Jason Crane series. I hope you'll pick up a copy of these 3 books. The audiobooks are absolutely fantastic.
It's called The Great Curse. The Great Curse can get inside your mind. Bad spirits come and whisper in the dark. It kills and kills and
starts the adventure, but have your schedule cleared for the next 2. The Jason Crane series by Richard Gleaves is scary, good fun. So pick them up, settle in, and you are guaranteed a happy Halloween. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm very happy to have Barbara Nickless on the show with me. I discovered her book Blood on the Tracks a little while back on Amazon, and was immediately intrigued. And I reached out to Barbara, and we have taken a little time to sync our schedules up, but I'm super happy to have her on the show with us this week. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Barbara, I begin each show with a variation of the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
Well, with me, it's kind of crazy. I was actually 3 years old. I was in the hospital having eye surgery and told my mom I was going to be a writer. And at that point, I couldn't read and I couldn't write, but I could fake it with the best. So I had these get well cards, and I would sit there and mimic handwriting, and then I would make up stories to go with the handwriting.
Oh, that's so cool. The vast majority of people that I ask that question, the vast majority of them can pinpoint a time and a place, and it's usually pretty young. And so I kind of have a theory that that storytellers are kind of born that way. and then we hone our craft and become writers. But I think there's something there in people that do this. They've known for quite a while that they want to do it.
I think you're absolutely right. It's almost like it's a calling instead of a profession. And
yeah.
Some of us, it takes longer to actually get around to making it happen, but I think we get there eventually.
Yeah, I think some people get weirded out a little bit when you use language like that, but I believe it. I really do. I've had, 150 or so writers on here, and our beginnings are all eerily similar. It's pretty crazy.
Well, and honestly, if you don't have a calling, what is going to drive you to sit alone in your room for hours playing with imaginary people?
Right. And there are lots of other things if you're looking for instant gratification and instant success. Yeah. There are a lot of other things you could pursue than sitting alone in a room. Right. Or, I have a couple of friends who are high-level scientists and are also writers, and that's a bizarre mix too, because they're just like double torture. It's pretty
kind of a left brain, right brain thing going.
Right. So your mother, did she encourage this when you were when you made that declaration, and did you get input from your family and encouragement?
Yes, I absolutely did. My mom was an English teacher, so we always had books in the house, and when I said I wanted to be a writer, she thought that was great. What was interesting with my mom was, for her, it was all the beautiful language, not the story, not the characters. And so she was constantly showing me examples of wonderful writing, and I never quite synced that with plot and character until I was much older.
That's great, because, I think we all can put our fingers on a piece of writing that's just lyrical. Maybe it's not a great way to say it, but the language is almost a character of its own. Like the book has a certain tone, and it's like being a character. It's really crazy. But you had a very interesting upbringing, didn't you? You were born overseas.
Well, yeah, I was made in Japan back in the days when you didn't want to brag about that, and then born in Guam. And yeah, my parents told me stories about that, which was definitely TMI. Too much information there about how I came to be. But my parents then settled in the U.S. when I was still pretty young, so I missed that chance to travel. I was kind of bummed about that.
Where were you raised for the most part?
Mostly Colorado. So we lived in Ohio, Mississippi, here, there, wherever my dad was an Air Force pilot. And so wherever he was sent, they just went to all the exciting places before I was born.
So, what part? All right. Well, I'm about 2 hours north of Biloxi. So,
so you know all about it.
Yeah. What part of Colorado were you in?
Colorado Springs.
Okay. Yeah, my family and I lived there for a couple of years, about 10 years ago. It's a beautiful place.
It is a beautiful place, right smack in the center of Colorado, and I'm grateful to be here. It's been kind of strange because of the weather lately. We had 2 huge wildfires here in 2012 and 2013, so it's taken a bit of adjustment. It's not quite the green state that it used to be.
Right. It's so sad.
Yeah.
So you made this declaration at a very early age that you were going to be a writer. How did that, was that something that you, from that moment on, you knew this is what you were going to do, or did you, a lot of us kind of know these things, but then we take the practical route and we start pursuing the things that are going to, maybe make us decent citizens and things like that, and not just a writer. So kind of what was the path that you took?
Well, you're absolutely right. I think, and I'm sure a lot of writers have the same experience, you can't actually write novels for a living. That people don't really get to do that, do they? So you follow all kinds of paths. And I tried to stick with writing, and actually started out as a journalism major in college after working on the newspaper in high school. And it was actually a terrible match for me because I'm such an introvert. Picking up the phone and cold calling someone was, yeah, definitely not comfortable for me. Yeah. So I switched over to English because that's what I loved and got my degree in English Lit. And then I went to work as a technical writer. So I kept flirting with the writing, but I didn't commit myself to actually trying to be a novelist until quite a ways down the road.
Did technical writing give you any satisfaction?
I loved being part of a team, which is something you don't get so much as a writer. And I loved seeing a product through from beginning to end. But in terms of the actual work, it helped that scientific side of my mind where I could organize information and figure out how to best present it to people. But it wasn't terribly creative.
Gotcha. At what point did you decide that you had a novel in you that you wanted to try your hand at?
Oh, that's a good question. I wrote my first novel in college while I was getting that English degree. And it was an epic fantasy, or the start of an epic fantasy, and it was my independent study project. So I wrote that and never did anything with it. And then years went by, and I wrote a couple of trunk books, those books that you have to get your million words, right?
Oh, right.
And then, actually, I don't think I was really committed to writing, even though I was going to conferences, I was writing, I was talking to other writers. But it was actually after my house burned down that I'd been working up until then, and after that, I did not go back. At that time, I was working as a piano teacher, and I lost all my music and my piano, and we moved away from the neighborhood. And so instead of going back to that, I decided, okay, now's the time. Do it now or move on to something else. And that's when I wrote Blood on the Tracks.
Wow. There's always, or not always, but some of the best things that we do are kind of born out of those times of hardship or maybe having a wake-up call. There's something jarring that seems to knock things loose in the creative person's mind, it seems like.
Absolutely. And everybody suffers trauma, and it's kind of a question of what we try to do with that.
Right.
And for me, what I found was my writing before the fire was definitely competent. I had an agent. I came close with one of those 2 trunk books in New York. But after the fire, I realized what I was missing, which was the ability to emote on the page. I was always holding myself back. And after the fire and after some other things that my family had been through, that perfect storm of events kind of boiled everything down to the essence. I think that's when I gave myself permission to put emotion on the page. And that made a big difference.
That's that's fascinating that even as writers, and we feel like we are probably some of the most emotional or some of the people that feel everything and bleed openly, even we hold back until we have something that gives us permission.
I do think that happens a lot. And I know in my household growing up, it was, and maybe you've experienced this too, being from Mississippi, but there was a Southern thing about we do not air our dirty laundry. Do not let people know about the skeletons in our closet. And actually writing the essay I wrote for Phoenix Rising, which was about going through the fire, was the first time I've talked about my family, and there's still some members of the family I'm hoping don't find that particular essay, but I felt like it needed to be said.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, and yeah, there's the first book I wrote has some of those things, and it's very uncomfortable when we start opening up and letting the world see what is truly going on. But I think that's our job as writers. Our job is to expose the world for what it is, so that hopefully through that things can change, can be better. And if it's wrapped up in fiction, I think that a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down, or however. But yeah, I think that's our job.
Yeah, you are so right. And I've been really blessed that since my book came out, I've had a lot of veterans or families of veterans reach out and thank me for kind of putting out to the world what they go through. And the fact that it's fictionalized, exactly, I think makes it easier for people to both relate to and to accept when it gets a little tough.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to come back to Blood on the Tracks in just a minute, but I want to look at, you said when you were a student, you started writing an epic fantasy. That I think a lot of writers think that first book they're going to write is an epic fantasy, and that's so very different from Blood on the Tracks. What was it that intrigued you about writing that sort of book?
That's an interesting observation. I wonder why people go in that direction. For me,
I don't know, but there's a large amount of guests that I've had who everybody says, I started writing this epic fantasy and it was going to be 800,000 words.
Yeah, and does writing in a completely different world give us permission that we feel we don't have if we write in the everyday world? I don't know. I loved science fiction and fantasy growing up, and Lord of the Rings and Lovecraft, and then all the great classic science fiction masters like Arthur C. Clarke and Larry Niven. And so I think whatever drew me to those writers in the first place kind of made that my first exploration as a writer. My mom also had a lot of mystery novels. She had a ton of books. So mostly it was classics and mystery novels. So I just read whatever was on the shelf. And then I got her to start reading the fantasy and science fiction. So that was a fun reversal.
What was the biggest challenge to writing fantasy for you?
To not try and be the next J.R.R. Tolkien.
So the same challenge that the rest of us have.
It's like if you want to write horror, you've got Stephen King. But that's how we learn. We study these writers, we see what worked, we see what made us fall in love, and we try to emulate that in our own writing. And eventually we move away from that and find our own voice. But I think it's a great learning technique. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
No. And I think it is hard to not be derivative and to not wear your influences on your sleeve. But I think you need to know who your influences are before you can kind of shed those. So, yeah, maybe we're onto something there.
Yeah, something to guard against for sure.
Right. So when you went through this, well, first off, what kind of books were the trunk books that you wrote?
So the first was a mystery set on Easter Island in the 1970s. And it wasn't badly written. It was set during the era of Pinochet with the secret police and just a country entirely in turmoil because Easter Island is owned by Chile. And the feedback I got from New York is Americans just aren't interested in a tiny island in the South Pacific in the 1970s. So then I said, well, the heck with that. I'm going to write a vampire novel. And I did, and I ended up not doing anything with that. Whether I'll ever go back to that, I don't know. My agent said, well, it's really not a vampire novel. It's a mainstream novel that happens to have vampires in it. And I like that. Vampires are a metaphor for so many things. So whatever I was exploring there, I was having fun with it. But the book was really not very good.
Do you think you'll revisit those?
I will definitely.
Or are you happy to just leave those in the drawer?
I'll definitely go back to the Easter Island book. There's something there. And I think, gosh, it wasn't that many years ago, but readers, I think, are more open to other cultures now and more curious about other locations. So hopefully I'll find some interest in that book.
Yeah, and it would seem to me like political intrigue it would be welcomed in this atmosphere that we're in.
Or I don't know, or everybody wants big beach reads right now.
Well, true. Yeah, we may all be shell shocked in the next few weeks and just need a vacation.
That's right.
Yeah. So what brought you to a police procedural?
I started thinking about a mystery because then it gives you a skeleton to hang your characters on, if that makes sense. Okay. So a dead body sort of forces a series of actions. And I love,
Right.
I'm half scientist and half writer, and that left brain, right brain thing we were talking about earlier. Working on a police procedural really made the left, I forget which side is which, but the logical side of my brain very happy because I got to learn all this information, and I love to learn. And so writing a police procedural felt more like a natural fit for me with that scientific bent. And then I found out that railroad cops have the same jurisprudence as traditional police. I didn't even know there were railroad cops. So I thought, well, that's it. It's a police procedural, but it's got a twist. So that's what set me off on that.
Yeah, I think finding that one thing that not a lot of people know about, or that kind of gives us a new way to tell the story. That's a great way to start for sure.
Yeah, it was. It was very interesting, and of course, then I had a huge mountain of research in front of me, not knowing anything about trains or railroad police. So,
Yeah, what is that like when? Okay, I have a great scenario. I've got a great setup here now. There's a handful of people that are really familiar with railroad police, and I don't want to make them mad.
Yeah.
How does the information gathering aspect of that come about?
The actual information gathering is a lot of fun. And just to touch briefly on that concern about there being that handful of people out there who know everything, that's the absolute terror. Once you ship that book off and go, oh my goodness, did I get this right? But for the research on this, I reached out to the local freight train company here in Colorado. Well, there's two of them. I reached out to one and was fortunate to find a railroad cop who was willing to help me. So I went up, saw his offices, got a tour of the yard, and we've been in contact ever since. He's been a huge help.
That I would imagine that would be invaluable, having an insider's perspective and getting the ins and outs for the little details that make the difference.
It is, because so many times I think when you're doing research, you're not even sure what are the right questions to ask. And so the other thing I did was subscribe to Trains magazine, and oh my goodness, there are people out there who really know this stuff.
Right. You mentioned earlier that when your house burned, that you were a music teacher at the time. I am a kind of a hack musician, and I absolutely love it, and I play multiple instruments, but none of them well enough to be a professional. But I'm absolutely fascinated by songwriters and by the ability to, and people listening to the show are probably tired of hearing me say this, but the ability to paint an entire picture in 100 or 200 words, and bring about the same emotional response that we as novelists, maybe in 50 to 100,000 words, get out. Of course, there's more texture and detail in a novel, but there's something powerful about music, and music mixed with metaphor and poetry that just becomes something completely its own thing. How does your music training influence your writing? Do you think, or does it at all? Or are these just two completely separate buckets for you?
That is another very interesting question. I had thought about that. I share your same awe and admiration for songwriters. They're poets, and then they have that additional layer of the music to go with it. I think, I guess more than anything for me, just sitting in the semi-dark and playing the music I love to play. And the only instrument I ever learned was the piano. So kudos to you for knowing many instruments.
Well, remember I said not well, so.
I suspect you're better than you're allowing. But yeah, I think just sitting there and letting the emotion of the music go through me while my mind sort of wandered, that was probably actually a very fertile place to get ideas. And I hadn't thought about that, Hank. I might have to start doing that again.
Do you listen to music while you write?
Before the fire, I did. I listened to soundtracks because then there weren't any words to distract me from my own words. And since then, less so, and I don't know why. And I've talked to other people who've been through traumas and found that some of the things that they so loved before the trauma kind of got taken away from them. So I'm just now starting to listen to music again and realizing what a danger it is to be able to download an album with a couple of clicks. So I'm starting to rebuild my library.
Wow, that's fascinating to me. I am very much a music listener when I write. It's almost like I can turn off the noise inside my head when I do that. It allows me to shift gears somehow. I can't explain
You're
it.
so right, and I think I need to go back to that. And do you mind if I ask you what kind of music you listen to when you're writing?
I love movie soundtracks. Yeah. One of my favorites right now is the soundtrack to Winter's Tale. That the movie from a few years ago that was made from that Mark Halperin book from the 80s. I love the kind of the rises and falls and tension, and there's something about movie soundtracks that you kind of you run the gamut. You can feel the tension rising, and you can feel the release, and I don't know. There's something about that for me that kind of allows me to I don't know, shift through those emotions as I'm writing. That's I know this probably sounds weird to non-writers, but trust me, there's something there about it.
Well, there have been all those studies about your brain on Mozart, so I think it works in all arenas of expression. But you're right that soundtracks, they have that story arc. The beginning and the rise to the midpoint, and then the huge climax. So that probably is very helpful.
Yeah. On your website, you say that you've chased your curiosity across multiple careers: raptor, rehabilitator, astronomy teacher, piano teacher, instructional designer, and even sword fighter.
I think we're back to that jack of all trades, master of none.
Right. Yeah. Were all of those things purposeful for you? Were you trying to pick up a certain skill or a certain piece of information, or was this just kind of, we are three-dimensional characters in our own story, and these are just things that just interested you and excited you?
It was a mix. So certainly I had to have the job that put food on the table, and that was the tech writing, which then led to instructional design, which was, I worked for Digital Equipment Corporation, and instructional design meant developing online training for a variety of things, which I loved. I always loved education. The working as the director of education for an observatory, that was love. I just loved astronomy. That's why I went back to work on a physics degree. It was always really a fantasy of mine to become a PhD physicist and PhD astronomer. But this was a way, again, for me to bring to people something that I loved and saw value in, and I wanted them to feel that same excitement. The falconry assistant, so I worked for the Colorado Renaissance Festival for years, and then also helped rehabilitate birds of prey for a rehabilitation group in Pueblo. And that was just love. I just loved birds. Yeah. I loved being so close to something wild, because these birds were wild, especially the ones we were rehabilitating.
You sound like a science fiction and fantasy writer with the things that interest you.
That's true. So where did I go sideways on this mystery stuff?
That's every good science fiction or fantasy book has a mystery at the core, though. So I don't think you're far from your passions at all. And I've read Blood on the Tracks. It's an amazing book.
You.
So you have not gone astray, I promise. But back to Blood on the Tracks, where, so you had the idea for, okay, if we have a dead body, there's all these circumstances that happen around it. And, if I put it, on the train tracks here, then I involve, a new cast of characters that allow me to, uncovers some other details that a lot of people aren't familiar with and lets me tell a really unique story. How far into this process did the story really start unfolding for you and you said, okay, now I know what this book is?
You do ask great questions. I haven't thought of these things. Yeah, I guess I had originally come up with the idea of the whole hobo crowd, and that intrigued me. People who are always on the move, who are homeless. They come together in these hobo camps, and that's their tribe, but they're never ready to settle down in one place. So it's that homeless group, but with I guess an additional twist on that. And I read a book called Hobo, appropriately enough, by Eddie Joe Cotton, and found out there really are modern day hobos, and these people are fascinating. So I started with that, pulled in that whole police procedural thing, but I didn't really have my story until I realized I wanted my character to be a former Marine. And this was the time when, in my mind, a lot of Americans really were not paying attention to what was happening overseas. And I felt like I wanted to bring that back into our houses so people knew what was happening. So that was sort of the third leg, the hobo, the police procedural railroad cop, and then the former Marine stuff.
And I think in the world that we live in now, that's an important story to tell, with our, so much going on with our veterans. And, like you said, I think it was really off a lot of people's radar, a little earlier, but hopefully, that's becoming, closer to people's thinking. And, do you think some of that came out of the trauma that you had dealt with personally? And this was a way to, connect with that trauma, but to show it from a different person's perspective, maybe?
I think you're right. Stories are cathartic, whether we're creating them or writing them. I mean, creating them or reading them. So, yeah, I'm sure there was some of that as I tried to explore what was going on in my own brain after what my family had been through. It certainly gave me an appreciation for the incredible level of trauma that some of our vets have experienced. So yeah, it was definitely a process for me of trying to heal.
Every good mystery book has a really good hook and several twists. Was there anything that you learned from writing this book about really throwing the reader off the trail and catching them with a good twist?
I think that was part of keeping myself entertained. I knew who I wanted my killer to be from the get-go. I didn't know how I was going to get there, and I didn't know if I changed my mind. And so I left that open. And it was just a way of, it was sort of a funhouse process for me of not always being sure where the story was going to go or who was really going to end up being my villain.
Which brings me to the question, are you an outliner or are you more of a pantser as you write?
I call myself a plantser. A combination of those. I really, that scientific part of my brain really wants an outline. I like everything organized. Yeah. I am rather OCD about things like that. And it just sounds lovely to have it all outlined and know where I'm going. But the other side of my brain gets really bored with that and just wants to get to the work. So I compromised. Yeah. I do try to know what my ending is. So I know, that metaphor about driving from New York to LA by the light of your headlights. So you're never quite sure. You can't see anything beyond the light of your headlights. So I knew I was trying to get to LA from New York, and I would plot just a little bit ahead, and then I'd get to go right, and then I would go back and try to plot again. And I definitely went down some dead ends, got myself in some box canyons, and I had to cut a lot of words I really didn't want to cut. They were beautiful, they were polished, they were scenes I loved, but they didn't fit in the story. So out they went.
Oh, man. There are a couple of different camps that are, I would say, like hard left and hard right. And I'm not talking about political leanings at all. I'm just just an illustration. And you've got like Stephen King on one side, who is, never outline anything. That's, you lose the heart of the story and all of that if you outline. Then you've got someone like John Grisham on the other side, who outlines meticulously. And you can read each of their books, and Stephen King's will be full of surprises, and sometimes it's absolutely brilliant, and sometimes you say, well, this 4 chapters I just read, I could tell he didn't outline them because they went nowhere, and we're right back where we started. And sometimes John Grisham's are, you can really tell that, man, this plot is really well laid out, and there's twists and turns, but there's no life to the story. And not to pick on either one of these men, because they're way more successful than either one of us. So, kudos to y'all, but just as illustration. But yeah, I'm with you. I think that thing in the middle is where to be. That, as storytellers, I think we need to know where we're going. But the joy in it is where the writer is just as surprised as the reader when things take those twists and turns.
Yeah, and I guess we have to find whatever system works for us. And I would guess that Stephen King and John Grisham are equally happy as writers. So they've each found their own way. Stephen King is such a natural-born storyteller. I mean, he's the guy you can picture around the campfire that everybody wants to listen to. And even when there's those 4 chapters that don't go anywhere, we're with him, right? We read them and we keep reading. So it's
yeah, I've never refunded one of his books. No. So, I
haven't either. But I've really enjoyed John Grisham too. It's almost a different kind of ride. So I guess what you're in the mood for.
Yeah. Yeah. And I buy and read everything those guys put out. So, they're doing something right. But, so first off, how long did it take you to write this book, Blood on the Tracks?
2 years. So I had the idea actually before the fire. Can you tell my life is kind of what's that word? Divided by, before fire and after fire. But I had the idea for that. And then once I decided I was really going to commit to the writing, I had to balance that between rebuilding our home, since we didn't have a pot to, the proverb, literally. So that was really actually a full-time job, but I managed to get the writing in there at the same time. So it was kind of 2 years between when I started and when I finished. And I actually I found representation with an agent before the book was actually done. So then I still had a third of the book to write, which was its own pressure.
Yeah. And I see that it's published by Thomas and Mercer. How did that go, getting the book, to press and out for the rest of us to find?
It was wonderful. It was a tough decision to go with Thomas and Mercer. And authors have so many choices these days, and I was very fortunate to have multiple options. But Thomas and Mercer were great in terms of how they handled everything and letting me have input, and things happened so quickly. It was really a joy once I'd finished my book to see it actually in print within such a short time frame.
That's awesome. And Thomas and Mercer, as we all probably know, is owned by Amazon, but it is really its own entity. But I think being owned by Amazon, they sure are nimble and they get things done really quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they're really on top of that.
Yeah. And the book has been very well received. It's only been out a short time. It's already got well over 1,000 reviews, and it's in the top 5 police procedurals, mystery, crime, murder. It seems like it's doing really well.
I will take your word for that. I quit looking a long time ago.
I think that's wisdom in action there. Stay away from reviews and rankings.
Get so hooked, especially for me on the reviews, because I'm such a people pleaser, and getting the reviews was really important to me. And there was an experiment they did with rats where they could press a lever and get a reward. And I think it was actually a direct stimulation to that part of their brain that gave them the most pleasure. And they would stop doing everything else in order to press that lever and get a thrill. And it was a little bit like that, where I kept hitting the refresh screen because the reviews were coming in so fast. It was astonishing. And so every time I refreshed the screen, there were more reviews. And then every once in a while, you get an electric shock with a bad review. And so I did that for a week, and I said, gosh, this is really not healthy. And I backed away from that.
Yeah. And that's, I think that's a great lesson for everyone to learn. And if you read too many of the 5-star reviews, then you have to give the same weight to the 1-star reviews. And that's really an unhealthy place.
Well, and it's funny because 25-star reviews and then one-star review, it wipes everything out. Wait, why did I read that? What am I doing to myself?
Yeah. Then you need to go collect 20 more 5 stars to even it out. Right. I know we should never judge a book by its cover, but the cover is the reason I picked up this book in the first place. It caught my eye. Then I read the description and all that good stuff. But that's a fantastic cover. Did you get any input in that?
It is a wonderful cover, and I did. They sent me the same artist, but 2 very different covers, and I fell in love with that one. And then it was a matter of tweaking the character on the tracks and the dog. And that was an interesting story. And we were working with trying to find the right dog because the dog in my book, the canine partner, Clyde, is a Belgian Malinois. But I had a picture on my website of a German Shepherd, and the dog's looking back over his shoulder as if danger's coming. And I love that picture. So I sent my editor that picture and said, well, look at this dog. And they didn't use the dog. I guess they used parts of the dog, but mostly they didn't use the dog. They did use the back of my head, which
nice.
I was not expecting. And so every time now I look at the cover, I say, wait, that's me, and that's not supposed to be me. So
that's awesome. That's awesome. And if you'd have put that German Shepherd face on the book, the dog people would have called you out on it.
You are right. You are absolutely.
Yeah. So what is next for Sydney Rose Parnell?
I am hard at work now on the next book in the series, which is Dead Stop, and that's due to release next August. So that's kind of my life right now, which is a great place to be.
That's really cool. Do you anticipate the series going longer? Do you think these will wrap up in 2 books, or kind of what are your plans?
It will not wrap up in 2 books, and beyond that, I don't have a great plan. I don't generally read a lot of series, only a few, and so now I put myself in this world of series, and I have to kind of figure it out. So it's a work in progress.
Well, that's as long as you can dream up dead bodies, I'm sure Sydney can
find
something too. Oh, yeah. Barbara, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show. Where can people find you and follow your work and all that good stuff?
Oh, my website, www.barbaranicklas.com, or they can find me on Twitter at Barbara Nickless. That would be great. And I have an author page on Facebook, so Barbara Nickless Author. And I would love for people to reach out. I really enjoy hearing from my readers. It's been so fun.
Great. And I'll put a link to all those places in the show notes of the show. Barbara, thank you so much. This has been a joy to talk with you. I love the book, and I'm going to tell everybody that will listen about Blood on the Tracks.
Thank you, Hank. It's been so fun. I've really enjoyed this.